So I got this 4-speed transmission in that somebody purchased on eBay. And they purchased an M22 with a 220 first gear. But they didn't realize that the 220 first gear really wouldn't work well with the 308 axle ratio they had in the back end. So a lot of times when you purchase a transmission, you really have to think about the axle ratio and the gearing of the transmission and how they're going to work together. In other words, how they're going to complement one another to give you the best performance. So anyway, I'm going to just do a little quick thing where I'm going to pull this transmission apart and swap out the 220 first gear ratio to a new M22Z 298 first gear ratio. But in the process, I want to show you the difference about what I do with gearboxes and with some of the stuff on eBay, you know, what's going on with that. So you can see the difference in the quality and the difference of the builds. Leave me a comment, let me know what you think. This is a fairly nice transmission. I'm not really one for putting cap screws on the side covers over here because a lot of times they can interfere with linkage components, and in general I want to keep things as low profile as possible. And I like the way the hex head cap screws, you know, grab this cover better and give you a bit more holding area. That's just my thing. On the front here, you've got bearing retainer. Guy was cool enough to put some small header type bolts in it, which is a cool idea. I like that, but it's something normally I don't do. Usually on the regular Muncie rebuilds, I use the straps. And when I convert this over to the new ratio set, I'm going to put the countersunk socket heads in this bearing retainer. Other than that, it appears to be a very good looking transmission. So what I did was I marked this transmission input shaft with a little red Sharpie over here, so you could see that the input, if I pull it, moves in and out. You see that? That's because somebody used the wrong gasket over here or didn't really know how to clearance the retainer to the main case. And as a result, you have this slop like this. Also, the reason why I don't like using cap screws with socket heads on certain applications, because sometimes people just don't have the tools. I put this in second gear. I'm going to pop this out. You can see the way the forks are worn. That's because this thing has got torque locking sliders in it, and the slider gets slammed against the fork. That's why I don't use torque locking sliders. Fairly new unit, and already you got fork wear. The header bolts are a good idea to use on these because with some Loctite, but there was only 3 of them on this transmission. What's weird about this, it had two sets of gaskets stacked on top of one another, which is probably the reason for that end float. So one thing I want you to notice here, this transmission is using the old front slinger system. Any 26 spline input shaft transmission I build uses an actual front seal. So I'm going to take this nut off, which actually just came right off. These are actually aftermarket nuts too. They always fit sloppy on these splines. I don't really like them. These are the ones made in Taiwan. I'm going to screw a bolt in here so I can disengage the reverse arm. Pop this pin out. Pull that up. So as I flip this thing around, I want you to notice there's a plug in it. I'm going to take this plug out because I'm going to replace this with a vent because we're going to be running a sealed system. Going to remove all these bolts now on the extension housing over here. 3 lower bolts. I'll also show you a little trick I do with these extension housings in the back over here, because auto gear has a tendency to make this thing so fat with the bolt sticking out like this, it can get in the way of certain cross members. So I've got this thing flipped upside down. Gonna pull it apart this way. As you can see, there's no bolt in this hole over here for the counter shaft. And I'm looking at this further, and I could see that this is not even machined as a relief for the bolt, and there's no Auto Gear logo on it. So this is one of these Chinese knockoff counterfeit plates that people buy on eBay. The problem with these plates is that they have a tendency to cock a little bit and actually wear out your extension housing bushing, because the yoke is cocked sideways in the bushing because nothing is straight here. It's kind of moved and shifted. So I'm going to have to change this plate as well as the gear set. This isn't that hard to do. Just pull this all out. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to change everything anyway. Got to pull out the counter shaft now. I'm going to actually put in the shaft that actually bolts on in the back over here. Let's take the cluster out. Save some of these needle bearings. Now these clusters have the tube in them. The newer clusters, we do not use a tube. This is a typical Taiwanese M22 gear that you see on eBay. They're not bad, but they're not really the best either. Here's something else to look at. Okay, these are the thrust washers that were in the transmission. These are simply steel thrust washers. No coating on them or anything. I'm talking about this transmission has less than 50 miles on it, and you can see that they're burning up, they're galling up. There's no type of coating on them. It's not a bimetallic thrust washer by any means. It's just standard steel washer. That's why they don't work. What I usually do is I take these washers and I substitute them with these bronze dimpled washers like this when I do a build. So you see the way these got these wear marks already on this fairly new transmission? That's because the 1-2 slider was rubbing against the reverse idler, because the torque locking sliders pull in the slider more than it should go. Look at that. And what I mean by that is, normally in the transmission, this idler gear is about over here. So when you push this slider into first gear, it can actually hit the edge of this reverse idler if you've got torque locking sliders and they pull in more than they should. And that's why I don't like using these particular sliders or these setups. From the looks of the snap rings and everything, I know exactly where this stuff is coming from. I know that this is a non-auto gear main shaft as well, but that's okay. Now, what I want to show you is if I take out the keys and springs and put this slider back on this hub here, you can see how sloppy this thing fits. Okay? I have a video showing how I blueprint these assemblies, but this is one of the problems why they don't shift fast. First of all, you got a sloppy fitting slider. It's a torque locking slider pulling itself into gear and laying the fork on the slider then and wearing out the slider groove and wearing out the shift fork prematurely. This is another counterfeit part. Kind of mimics the auto gear part. This is the auto gear sleeve. You can see it has this kind of groove on the bottom of it over here and a little bit thinner oil relief groove. When measuring this piece against this piece has got about 1/1000 run out in parallel within the inside bore, and that will cause a very hard apply, like trying to get it on the shaft. It's actually very difficult to get off because it's actually cocking itself like this at an angle when you're trying to get it on the main shaft. So these things look the same, they've got the same taper and everything like that, but this is definitely one of the other counterfeit parts often seen on eBay. I'm not going to use this either. Okay, so the reason why these are counterfeit plates, number one, is there's no auto gear logo on the plate. And it's not machined for the relief for the counter shaft to clear. These particular plates, they may look good and they may work in some applications, but they overload the gear train because this surface is not parallel with this surface over here. The two surfaces are off. If I take a micrometer and I measure over here, this area at this edge over here, for example, I'm at 507 thousandths. If I go to this section over here, I'm at 503 thousandths. If I go to this section over here, I'm at 499 thousandths. So they vary all over the place, and that's why I don't recommend buying them. I don't recommend buying knockoffs that people make to try to make a quick buck on. When you can get the USA made plates that are much better, much consistent. The USA plates, they're within 1,000s from front to back. Okay, so this is all the parts I took out of that guy's transmission. It was the Taiwanese M22 gears, the really sloppy sliders and hub assemblies, the counterfeit mid plate, the counterfeit first gear sleeve, and some other crappy synchronizer rings, and the counter shaft and the tube. I'm going to replace this with the M22 Z gear set with the Zero Rock synchronizer assemblies, Italian-made gears, the better mid plate, and the sealed front system. I countersink these holes over here because a lot of times that bolt gets in the way of cross members. So you can see here the pilot area where it was grabbing on the old input shaft. This pilot area is extended on the new input shafts by Auto Gear. It's extended enough to compensate for the difference in the case. And if we look over here, you're going to be able to see the difference between the threaded input, which doesn't take a front seal, and this particular input shaft where the bearing presses on is held in place with a snap ring in this groove, and a front seal rides in this surface over here. Okay, as you can see, the counter gear, the main drive, and the reverse idler are in the case. As you can see over here, I put one of my extended fit counter shafts that are threaded with the hole in it so it can actually bolt to the mid plate. And of course, using my red line gaskets this time. Okay, the unit's ready to go together. I'm just going to show you a few of the other features of the newer parts that I'm going to add to that transmission. So I've got all 6 bolts torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. And if you notice, I got this bottom bolt fitting flush now with the extension housing because I counterbored it. This way, if there's a cross member, it'll at least clear it, because beforehand that bolt was sticking up about this far. And I believe in some of the Pontiacs, it tends to like hit the cross member, and some of the Novas. So this way we resolve that issue with a simple counterbore. The new retainer I'm going to be using is going to have a front seal in it. It's going to work with this input shaft over here. It's going to seal in this area over here. I don't really like using these Allen head type of fill and drain plugs. I find that they strip really easy, and then you have to put an extension on it and a wrench on that to get it in the car. And sometimes there's not enough room in the tunnel. So I get rid of these and I put a standard hex type plug on these. These work much better. They have a lot better bite than this little small hex over here. I'm also going to be substituting the little 1/4-inch pipe plug that they had for a vent now, because we're using a sealed system. So this vent is going to go in place of this plug. So this new bearing retainer, I'm talking down to 25 foot-pounds. This is the retainer that has the seal in it. And notice the countersunk cap screws. Since I just finished that transmission and installed a different gear ratio with it, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to explain to you why something like that matters and why it's important. So the person wanted an M22 transmission. And the M22 typically comes, standard from the factory, with a 221st gear. And with the 221st gear, he had a 308 axle ratio. So let's do the math. We got 220 times a 308 axle ratio. That's going to equal an overall first gear ratio of 6.77. Now in old school days, you would have normally used a 221st gear. Most of the cars sold by GM with 221st gear had a 373 rear. That's 220 times 373. And it's basically your first gear ratio multiplied by your rear axle ratio. So the 221st gear ratio multiplied by the 373 axle ratio gives you an overall first gear ratio, if you want to think of it like that, as 8.2 to 1. What's really important is your overall first gear ratio. And if you kind of look at performance statistics, an overall first gear ratio of usually anything about 8 to 1 is much better. And in the day, most of the time when I built transmissions that did 221st gears with 373s in the back end, people hated it. And I was always converting them to 256 first gears or 252 first gears, whatever they had, available, to just give that car a little bit better acceleration. Now, by today's standard, for example, like a Mustang GT, like an old 5.0 Mustang GT, had a 335 first gear transmission. Write that down here. With a 2.73 rear. Now, if you think about that, okay, and you do the math on that, it's 335 times 2.73. That gives you an overall first gear ratio of 9.14. So is that really better? Well, you get really good acceleration, but now your first gear ratio is getting farther and farther away from 1 to 1. Thus, somewhere along the line, your ratio drops are going to become huge, and you're going to suffer from acceleration because the shift points you make are going to put more of a load, more of an RPM drop on the engine. When people talk about close ratio and wide ratio, it really doesn't mean much as it used to mean back in the 60s. What's really important is that your shift points match the torque curve of your engine so that it's not falling out of that range, and when you're shifting, you're not either overloading the engine or lugging it, that it's got a nice clean pull all through the gear ranges. In other words, from first through fourth or from first through fifth, the thing hauls all the way without stumbling or choking. That's what you really want. So here's an easy way to look at the close and wide ratio gearing. You can go on my website. There'll be a link on the description of this video so you get a better understanding. But let's say fourth gear is always direct. It's 1 to 1. Okay? And let's go, say, over here and make first gear 2.2 to 1. And then over here, let's make first gear 3.3 to 1. So the farther away you get from 1 to 1, your drops are going to be wider. Over here, I can go from 220 to 1 to 1. Say here, first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear. But now over here, I have first gear over here. I may be able to make second gear close with somewhere over here, third gear over here, then I'm going to have a big jump over there. So where here I have these nice clean little jumps, over here I'm going to have wider jumps. So again, the farther away you get from 1 to 1, the wider your ratio spread inevitably has to be. So it depends again on what you're doing with the transmission. If it's just going to be a cruiser, then it's okay. So in this situation where this guy had this setup over here with the 220 and the 308, if I substitute this now with a 298 first gear, which is what we put in the M22Z, let's do that right over here, 298 times 308, is going to have a nice overall first gear ratio of 9.17. That's pretty cool. If we take this figure over here, 917, then we go over here and we divide it by 220. So if we took 917 and we divided it by 220, that would be equivalent to having a 416 rear. In other words, 220 times 416 would equal 917. So we can kind of get the best of both worlds sometimes, depending again on what our application is and how our car is cammed, and get a better enjoyable ride. So that transmission was really a fun build to do. I think that guy's going to be really happy with the 298 first gear compared to the 220 first gear with that 308 axle. Click on this little link above over here. There's a page on my website on close and wide ratios explained. It's been pulled from my book, Building and Modifying High Performance Manual Transmissions. It's a great read. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel. Leave some comments below. See you next time.